Good afternoon. I'm here with Koryn and Kim, and we are coming to you with the next Scripture Sister verse. So this will be the next verse for over the next course of the next 2 weeks that we're going to be writing down on note cards, meditating on, and seeing kind of what God speaks to us. But we love to kind of have somebody share what it means to them and why it's important to them and what God has worked in their life. So Kim is going to do that for us and let us know what the verse is.
I'm excited to find out.
Thank you for being with us today.
You're welcome. When you asked me to do this, a couple of verses particularly sprang to mind that I have memorized and often use in situations in my life. And this is one that probably, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of other people have memorized as well. But Romans 8:28, all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to His purpose. And that, it's a verse that I think, whenever things happen in our lives that are not how we want them to be sometimes, whether it's difficulties or just surprises, things like, Lord, this is not what I expected. That's a time when this verse, I think, is really helpful to remember that God is working out good. As I thought about the last couple of days, I think it's really important to keep it in the right context and to understand what several things in it mean, because it's easy to pull that verse out and just kind of go, oh, God's going to fix all this.
Yes.
And I don't think that's what this verse means. There are a couple things. One, it's a promise for believers. It's not a promise for everyone. If you're not a believer, it says for those who love God. So that's pretty specific. And it's a promise that He's working things out for His purpose. And sometimes, I think the other thing, it's important to understand the definition of good. That working things out for good, there's kind of a situational good that we often want. There are many things that happen in our lives that are not what we would describe as good. A death in the family, a death of somebody we care about unexpectedly, illness, loss of finances. There's so many things that you would look at and go, that's not good, and that's a situational good. But there's God's greater purpose when they talk about His purpose, and good can mean not just that He's going to fix that problem, but ultimately His greatest purpose is that He's going to help us become more like Christ. I think about the verses in James, in the first chapter of James, where he tells us to be happy, basically, when we face trials, and that is totally against our nature. Like, Lord, I don't want this, but he goes on to say, because those trials produce endurance, they produce character in you, that will make you more like Christ if we accept them and let God work in our lives. And so that's that. When we look at this verse and we say, God's going to bring good out of this, we can think of things that I still look at a couple situations and go, I'm still waiting, Lord.
Yes.
It's been 7 years and I'm not seeing a lot of the good yet. But it's really, it is more keeping that in perspective of knowing that God's purposes. And I think sometimes we can look back in our lives and go, oh, wow, I really see where God took that, and maybe I didn't even deserve it, but He brought good out of that.
Yeah.
Or,
Can you think of a specific instance in your life where that has happened for you? Where you have the 2020 hindsight now
To look back and see.
right. I was thinking about, when we went over to Germany, we'd been married a couple of years and had been Young Life volunteers for quite some time, and were asked to go on staff overseas in Germany, and really struggled with that. And I think it's hard. I tell my kids that this was 1988, so the uncertainty around what that would look like was so much greater than it is now, because there was no internet.
Yeah.
There was no personal computers. There were no cell phones.
Yeah.
all of the ways that we keep in contact now, emails and texts and group apps and all of that didn't exist.
It was really moving away from your community and not having a link back as easily.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It was moving very much into an unknown.
Yeah.
And so we prayed about that and got a lot of advice for about 6 months, and finally had to make that decision. And this is my husband who, when we were dating, said he was born in Virginia, grew up in Virginia, and would be happy if he never left Virginia. And I'm going, I don't think this is going to work. Because I have these travel genes that my youngest daughter's inherited. So he was the one finally the day before we had to make a decision that said, I think we should do it. So we did, and the thing I remember about that is his former Young Life leader, who has been kind of a mentor to him in many ways and was when he was in college and younger, told us before we went, he said, if you get there and face some real difficulties, it doesn't mean that God wasn't in that decision.
Uh-huh.
And that's something I remember really all our life, is just that difficulties don't mean that God is not in the process. And we did get there, and it was interesting. The first year was pretty tough because the military doesn't know exactly what to do with Mormon chaplains. They're not Jewish and they're not Catholic, and so they put them in with the Protestants.
Yep.
So the new chaplain coming in that summer was Mormon.
Okay.
In our community in Burke, and he was not really thrilled with what we were doing.
Okay.
The evangelical Christian ministry.
Okay.
And so he made things pretty difficult for us, and to the point where there was support in the community, and eventually my husband and I at 28 sat in this large room with all of these lieutenant colonels and the general at a table, and they discussed Club Beyond, and finally General Schaffner said, there is a place for Club Beyond in Würzburg, and he looked at all of his lieutenant colonels and said, make it work. So that helped change things, and it was really, we laugh at the story because a few weeks later we were at the O Club, and we had a little booth, and everybody had their community outreach or all sorts of different activities. And General Schaffner happened to walk by, and we said, General, we really appreciate you, standing up for us and saying what you did. And he looks at us and he goes, don't screw up. Sir, yes, sir.
Yeah.
So, and we're, civilians. I say I speak military because of those 4 years in Germany, but that was, we had a wonderful 4 years there, and some wonderful ministry that grew out of that, kids' lives that, God really touched. A lot of whom, because of Facebook, we're still in touch with, which is really cool.
And these are kids who might not otherwise go to a church.
Absolutely.
But they would go to Young Life Club.
Absolutely. That's what, Young Life, which is called Club Beyond over there, is about, reaching out to kids that aren't churched. But what his, what Carl told us about, remembering that just because you're facing difficulties doesn't mean God wasn't in that decision.
Yeah.
And I think is really key. And, as moms, it's sometimes even harder when we watch our kids face difficulties. And that we want to fix it. We want to make it better, and it's not going to happen. I mean, not only will they face difficulties, and the Bible tells us that you will have difficulty in this world. You will have problems, but it's important to remember, I think, that it will grow them and their faith and their endurance and who they are as who their character is. And we have to kind of let that process happen sometimes, and just trust. And that's why, coming back to this verse, that all things, God will work all things together for good for those who love God. And
I like what you said about our definition of good is not always what God's definition of good. It reminds me of Marty's sermon on Sunday. I don't know if you heard it, but where he talked about God's great plan for this earth isn't for our comfort or our freedoms even,
right?
But it's for the salvation of souls on earth and the kingdom to come in heaven.
Yeah.
And so those are the goods that he has desired to accomplish through these trials or circumstances, the salvation possibly of some of these kids in your Young Life ministry. That's the good that he is aiming for.
Right.
At the expense of our comfort.
Yeah.
Right.
The greater purpose that we can sometimes lose track of when the world becomes all consuming and this is what we see, we forget, this isn't it. We have a home in heaven we're going to. So like you had said, our purpose is to be holy and to know God and make him known, not necessarily be comfortable.
Right.
And how does he grow us? A lot of times through trials, because that's when we push into him more.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the global picture of Christians around the world, you know, so many are facing death, they're facing persecution, they're facing, you know, some really difficult times.
Yeah.
And when you look at this verse and you go, you know, how can
That's not good.
That's not good, and yet it is when we redefine what good is.
Yeah.
And that, you know, whatever they're going through, for whatever reason, we're chosen to be in a very comfortable place.
Yeah.
You know, in suburban Virginia, for most of us. But that doesn't mean we have difficult things. You know.
Yeah.
And like I said, I think sometimes for our children, it's really a struggle. And I was just talking to my youngest daughter, who's at NC State, senior engineering student. She's their goalkeeper for their soccer team, and is going through some tough times right now with her coach, and partly because of who he is and his personality. And she came home this weekend and just to have a little family time, which was really a blessing. But you know, we were talking about how the things that she has learned and the way she's matured over the last 3 years, and being able to stand up for herself sometimes, to take some leadership, and leading a small group Bible study down there on the team, and things that she will, I said, there's a good chance you will face a boss like this someday.
Yeah.
And we'll have to, and things
It's
that,
just in training.
yeah,
Exactly.
absolutely. So as much as we want to fix it and make everything smooth, it's not always the best path for it.
Yeah.
So what would you say is one of your key tips on Bible memorization? Like how do you get this word in your heart so that you can recall it instantly when you're faced with something? It's just, you know, seared into your heart and your mind. Do you have a method?
I think, and this, you know, back when I was in life as a kid, as a high school kid at West Springfield High School, you know, we would, it's just like school to some extent, you know, write verses on, we had scripture memorization cards, and, you know, memorizing just like you would anything else, you know, keeping it somewhere where you see it, you know, putting it in your car, because we spend so much time driving in our cars. You know? But I still think it's really key to not only memorize the verse, but to memorize the reference.
Yes.
Because I am often pulling out verses. I go, you know, oh, remember where it says, where does it say that? You know, and I get stuck with that.
And we're not forced anymore to do that. We used to memorize each other's phone numbers back in the day.
Yeah.
Why do we have to do that anymore?
Now you just look for their name.
Yeah, but I think you're right. Knowing where it is in the scripture is really important too. If you're sharing this with somebody who maybe doesn't read the Bible or know the Bible, right? Just to be able to point right to where it is in the scriptures is helpful.
Yeah, there's you know, the things that I have that have stuck with me the most are things that I've written down and put somewhere where I'm going to see it. There was a woman who spoke years ago, at least 10 years ago at BCC, and I would have to apologize to her if she heard this because I don't remember her name, so I can't reference it. But the one thing she said that really stuck out to me, and I've shared this with a number of young moms, is she talked about with our kids that there are 3 things we need to do, and this speaks to trusting God and hearing and that He's really good, and it was love them, trust God, and pray.
Yes.
And that's on my mirror. Love them, trust God, pray. You know, and that's all we need to do. Is that we need to love them and let God work out the good in their lives.
Yeah.
And I've always remembered it because I wrote it down and I put it on my mirror, and it's still there. So I think, you know, writing scripture down, putting it someplace where you're going to see it daily, is really, really important and really helpful. So yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that this afternoon.
Yeah,
I know a lot of women will be encouraged by your story.
Yeah.
We're going to start writing these down, these verses
Yes.
are so, you know, impactful to other people and can be in our lives.
Yeah,
putting them on our mirrors and our kitchen cabinets and in our cars.
Right.
exactly.
Well, I love I've used your bathroom before we met, and you have scripture right up there on the wall, which is, I think is beautiful.
Yes, put it everywhere. So
That's
it
right.
the verse they said to like tie it on. They had the robes, or
Yeah,
or
tie it
on the
your
door
wrists
frame.
and when you're walking in the way.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
in our case, driving in the way.
And we've kind of lost that with it being so easy to find.
Yeah.
But it's so important to know it. And
I know that verse is under Deuteronomy somewhere.
That's
yes,
right.
exactly.
Yeah.
See, we're still like,
Yeah.
where is it? Yay. Okay, so Romans 8:28.
Romans 8:28. All things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to His purpose. And His is as
Yep.
italics there.
His purpose and His
His
good.
purpose.
It's different than ours. Which is why we have to have that piece of trusting and knowing who He is. So when the things that come that we don't get, or you being there for that year and being against someone that you're like, Lord, why are we having this person that's fighting this good cause?
Right.
And trusting Him to bring it about. That's really cool. Thank
So
you.
in a couple of weeks, we will be implementing this verse onto some art form that
Yes.
we can hand over to somebody else or mail to somebody else to help encourage them in their walk.
Yep. The next piece. Give it to somebody else.
Yeah.
Thank you, ladies.